as we speak, someone asked to join. Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are joining us from. For those who don't know me, I'm Tom Seidenstein. I'm the chair of the IAASB. My job is simple today, just kicking the meeting off. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for taking their time to join us at this important roundtable. This is our first of 3 roundtables that are related to either fraud or going concern that's coming up in the next month or so. And this topic really hits on all 3 elements of our strategy. Is dealing with an issue that is of the utmost public interest importance. Secondly, dealing with it in a way that is agile and is meant to help us be very tightly focused on the real issues of the day. And thirdly, broad stakeholder engagement. So I'm really pleased that this is happening. And I want to thank our staff for doing so much work in getting this roundtable ready. And let me just say the issue of fraud, in my little bit more than a year that I've been chair, it's a topic that comes up in almost every venue I visit. And the issue of technology permeates all right now. And my previous life, partly running an innovation lab, the issue of technology is one of the great advances in technology has been the ability to detect fraud. Of course, there's a flip side of that. It also helps to perpetrate fraud too. So, I think it's really important that we kick off our public interactions on fraud with a roundtable like this. So it's really timely and important for us. And so I really just wanted to say thank you for joining. This is of the utmost importance to the board. And I want to turn it over to our very capable Deputy Chair, Fiona Campbell. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. And I think good morning, good afternoon, good evening from me as well to each of you joining us. I'm going to say tonight because that's the time zone that I am in. I am joining you from what used to regularly be referred to as the world's most livable city, being Melbourne, which is where I think Roger's joining from as well. Sadly, I'm not sure it can claim that title anymore. I'm sure you're all aware we are in a reasonably severe lockdown and nightly curfew, which has kicked in already. So none of us are allowed to leave the house now. I think we're 4.5 weeks into 6 weeks, which has meant being in some form of lockdown, I think now for 6 months now. So like everyone, I think we are learning to adapt quickly, but I must admit, I think I am not alone when I say it would be nice to see what the plan out of the lockdown with curfew will be. So I look forward to hearing that in the next few days. But you know what? There is actually no place I would rather be than spending my evening talking about fraud and technology and fraud in the digital age, and hearing everyone's views and insights. And I'm really grateful that you've all agreed to join us to share your expertise and experience with us. As Tom alluded to at the start, this is a bit of an information gathering phase that we're in as an IAASB. So we're exploring this sort of very broad topic of fraud. There will be certain areas where we're going to have to do more work and delve into more details, obviously. And one of those is particularly around the role of technology in relation to fraud. So thank you for all agreeing to join us for that topic and bring your expertise with us. Just a couple of housekeeping and practical matters. If everyone could remain on mute, obviously not the panelists and speakers when it comes time to speaking. You're allowed to unmute yourself. And if you're not speaking, if you could have the video off as well. We will use the digital hand that hopefully you're all familiar with, that you can raise if you would like to ask a question. And then part of the session as well will be done using breakout sessions, which obviously some of you may have used this functionality before or experienced it before with Zoom, but we'll explain that when we get a little bit closer to that portion of the session. But they're the sort of housekeeping ones. I think if there's any general questions or you're having technical difficulties, I think if you put a question into the chat, we have a couple of staff who are helping us as well in case there are any issues like that. As Tom also said, we've got a couple more roundtables coming as well on the expectation gap and on less complex entities as well. So later in September and then early October. So this is the first of a series of 3, so please be gentle with me. This is number 1. I'm sure by the time we get to number 3, it will be a perfectly well-oiled machine. But we are very excited to hear from what is a very broad range of participants that we've got joining us, and obviously you'll get to hear and learn a little bit more about each other as we get into the breakout rooms as well. But before we get there, we've got an hour of fun. We've got a keynote speaker joining us, David Clark. He's the chair of the Fraud Advisory Panel. And I'll just give a quick update on the overview of the bio, and then I'm sure David might also want to correct anything I get wrong, but also add to it if you would like to as well. David is the Group Head of Translation Compliance and Multilingual Due Diligence at Guildhawk. He's a specialist in counter-fraud measures. He's a former Detective Chief Superintendent and a member of the UK Government's Fraud Review Team, and is responsible for designing and leading the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau and lead force for fraud. The Fraud Advisory Panel is a member-based organisation that looks at best practices in fraud prevention, detection, investigation and prosecution, and helps people and organisations to protect themselves against fraud. So clearly our keynote speaker is well and truly qualified to talk on this topic, and I will hand over to you now, David. Thank you.
That's lovely. Thanks ever so much, Fiona, and good day, good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak on behalf of the Fraud Advisory Panel and give you a bit of an update about what we think about this subject. Maybe give you some idea, hopefully give you some very good ideas to think about where the issues and the opportunities are. I've got a small set of slides. I think rather than seeing my mug, it might be better if you see those. A little bit. I'll go through, giving some examples about what happened in the past, and also some of the threats that we're seeing now, and then take you into what we're seeing as emerging. And I'll try and bring it back round to really what audit assurance, the tremendous part that you and your members and your profession have to play in all this, which is key if we're going to learn from and be stronger in the future. And I do really believe very strongly that you are some of the greatest gatekeepers that can make some of these things happen. I'll explain why as we go through. So I've got a few slides, and I'll leave 5 minutes if you've got any particular questions, or you can have my email and the team, because I'd like to really talk about the situation and what I see as being some of the issues, solutions, and leave it open to you. So if I just go on to the first slide, little bit about my charity here, and I haste to add, we are a charity. We've been around for 20 years. I'm the chairman now, very honoured to be chairman. I've been a member for many years. We're a collective group of professionals. We are counter-fraud professionals across the spectrum. Our links to the audit accounting profession is that the Institute of Chartered Accountants England and Wales are probably our longest and strongest supporter. Give us a grant. They set us up 21, coming up for 22 years ago. And if you think about what was happening 22 years ago with issues and concerns about some of the major frauds we had then, and we are across sectors. We're all volunteers. We actually have 2 members of staff. My day job, I'm a director of company Guildhawk Global, based in London. Homework, in actual fact, for the last few months. But so that's kind of what we are. We simply believe that the world is stronger when we, fight fraud together. And we do lots of global initiatives, work with lots of industries. Go on to the next slide. This is something that when I speak, I do quite a bit of work with the UN and the OSCE, both with the charity and with my own company, with some of the briefings, training and assistance that we provide. And this is a slide I had on one piece of work I was doing in Armenia with the OSCE that I put up, which I still think is quite telling, because this tells a bit of a story, I suppose, about where I came from. I used to be in the military police, and I served in Northern Ireland long before I became a City of London police officer. But my welcome then was into anti-poll tax riots. We had our first sort of inner city protests that turned bad back in '89. I thought I got away from sort of terrorism, and then we had the '92 bomb that was at St Mary Axe, detonated by the IRA, a criminal organisation that they still exist in one frame or another. We had another bomb in '93, then '94. They were trying to get people to the table. Then in '99 we turned anti-capitalist riots again in the city. I was policing, doing the intelligence work and community work on that. Seemed like a little bit of it. That continued for a couple of years with the anti-capitalist protests against corporate organisations, debt, corruption, and so on. And we had a period of calm. 2005, then Western attacks with the 2005 attacks on the City of London. 2008, I was heading up the fraud squad national teams when we had the financial crash and fraud. Then 2016, the sort of turning again, still some of the questions around greed. And I was saying, what will 2020 be? I never cease to amaze. 30 odd years in law enforcement and intelligence. I still, never get surprised by we're going to be hit with something else. Those two chaps up the top, they were some people I helped with a client, a lady from a corporate who got involved in romance fraud. She gave 1.6 million to fraudsters in a romance scam where she was suckered into something, and the truth is that all these things, these go back hundreds of years, as you know, and fraud and corruption, same as terrorism and other acquisitive crime. They're just new ways. They have new ways of perpetrating. They're the same old ways, but they're using new technologies. And, we've got to be alert to these. We go to the next slide. What we've seen, and when lockdown came, with my charity, I decided to, speaking with the police and government cabinet office in the United Kingdom, and a number of partners said, look, we really need to sort of get information out quickly. So we set up a group called COVID-19 Fraud Watch, specifically at sectors and our partner network, corporate partners we have, like Institute of Chartered Accountants, but many others, Security Institute, who often don't speak, Department for International Trade, so representing groups. How do we get information out quickly about, the great advice that our experts have put out over the years to make sure people are prepared so we can anticipate, but also it's a two-way thing. We use a Chatham House, and I wanted intelligence in. That was my background when I run national fraud intelligence. How can we make sure we get into intelligence in quickly about the things we're seeing into government and the police? And that's been really successful. So what I can give you here is a pretty much up to date what we're seeing in the UK since April, when we set this up. We run it every week. We have briefings and information sharing securely across our network. And the kind of things we've seen, latest ones really is the open web, dark web, being used to recruit money mules to harvest company identities. Payment diversion went in very quickly, especially stuff coming from government to local authorities out as the stimulus aid. We forecast this. Phishing emails, phishing emails, as you know, are nothing new really. We used to have fax machines, and lots of fax messages were the way people conned people before. Phishing has gone big. Hacking of business phones, the use of malware and ransomware have been in there. Data breaches. There was a fear here that when we put so many people, and I don't know, certainly in Australia, but in the UK, US, with many firms, my firm included, we've kept everybody across the business remote working, 5 offices all empty. But we did lots of risk assessment work, all the security measures, physical security, and touch wood, we haven't seen massive problems here, but that was a big concern. What we have seen is a rise actually in that thing about the lonely hearts and people being online so long, often alone, they're getting conned into online scams. Dating frauds has gone up, people with buying things online, they've been had over. We expected that, but what I was particularly concerned about is what were the criminals doing while we were all in lockdown? Probably every city you were in, lockdown, police everywhere, criminals didn't come out, but they were in doing their planning. And what we thought is serious organised crime groups, the SOCs, they're using it as a hook for all manner of things, investments, and also they love, like after Hurricane Katrina in the United States, you know, they love going after government or charitable money, grants, anything. And that was what we kind of saw was happening, and it has happened. We've had this. I've gone to the next slide. Sorry, I'll just finish off on that last one. The kind of solution that how we get around that is quite simply intelligence sharing. We've got to, you know, there's in the UK we've got what 5.6 million SMEs, actually about 1.3 million actually employ people. To get intelligence and information out saying don't fall for this sort of thing, it's really difficult. So we've pushed for a long time for mass public awareness with a consistent message. There's been a bit of mixed messaging going out. That makes us vulnerable. So getting standard operating procedures for what we get out there, and we've been pushing for that, has been key. And we have had intelligence going in, about over 100 arrests linked to organised crime and COVID. A lot of it from stuff that we've helped feed in from our group. And I say we're all volunteers. So that's what we've sort of seen. On to the next slide. What trends we're seeing, again, as we suspected, the government stimulus. We've got these bounce back loans. They're, you know, a lot of pressure. My chairman and CEO of my company, we were there, get this money out to people. You know, we can't wait. You know, company's going to go under, and do you have to give a security or not, on a personal security? So completely understand it, but what due diligence would be done, and we were fearful of that. Boiler rooms and pension liberation, that's an emerging area, but certainly we've seen now the Beebles type bounce back loans. Mule's been set up. Remember I said online, Phoenix companies were worried about, there'll be something coming out shortly on that. People using shell companies, dormant companies. Even in Italy, what we've seen there, organised crime groups, you may have seen, I think it was in June, 92 arrests around the mafia getting into really good companies with a clean history, you know, and this is just heaven for them. They can get in, a bit like the Russian mafia used to do a few years ago. Get somebody to do a few bits of dirty work for you, and then you've got them hooked. They can't go to the police, but, you know, their business would go under without it. And the bit I've raised here, and you know, US, UK, obviously as two of the major you know, financial centers of the world, the two major ones. I think we've got to be so careful on this. Up the top there, you see two guys there. It's a guy on the left is Kalakis. This goes back to 2003 to 2008. They were into a big property scam. It's an SFO case, one of the sort of really good cases that the Serious Fraud Office of the United Kingdom ran. Kalakis and Williams in 2013, they managed to, you know, overinflate commercial property to get mortgages from two major banks, and you know, to the tune of 61 million. And just the lack of due diligence, the judge was highly critical. Go online, read the Serious Fraud Officer's account. It's a fantastic case study. Why am I mentioning it here? Because that's what happens, as you know, every crisis where we have money readily available, or in the boom time when you can get loans quickly. Why do the systems not work? You know, with Enron, why didn't it work? Technologies, when I was doing the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, you know, obviously I'm coming from an operational side where I want the intelligence to help me gain evidence, but you're not doing that with fraud prevention. You're trying to stop it, but the technology wasn't working. Why did we not pick up on those? So the solution here really is, we've said transparency. We need to get businesses being more transparent. We've called on the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, in the UK to publish Beebles data, and because, you know, millions of grants, billions have gone out to people, but we're not being able to do data matching. So if we had we do have technology, we can't use it. Next slide. And then there's a letter. I was really surprised. I actually wrote. I sort of suggested we write and give some suggestions to the the Chancellor, but it also followed up with Duncan Hames from Transparency International, Sue from Spotlight, Rosalind Wright, former head of the Serious Fraud Office, and Professor Mike Levy, who many of you all know as the authority on counter fraud, the academic. And the bottom line seems to be saying, no, we're not going to publish it. Criminals know this. So how can we use technology which we could data match and identify criminals and get the money back before it disappears, because that's always the problem. There's technology out there, two great systems. One is the National Fraud Initiative run by a firm, Synectics. Terrific, best in the world. National Fraud Bureau is pretty good too. But if we're not going to give them it, this is a real problem. And I'm surprised at that. Next slide. Sorry, and my question now is, we've got in the past technology that was available wasn't turned on. People were critical of things like autonomy that Hewlett-Packard bought. Great system, only if you train it and turn it on. How do you go in and audit, make sure it's being used for the right reason? Wirecard is probably got a little bit of the hallmarks of the Kalakis case with the 2008 or 2013 prosecution, because Wirecard, there is the money in the bank, whereas Kalakis, it was, have you really got that tenant from Hong Kong, paying you all this money? And with Kalakis, all it took was a telephone call from the German investors to check with the Hong Kong company, who said, never heard of them. That's not our bank. So you can imagine the judge had a bit of a field day. Wirecard, the technology is probably some of the best technology we've got out there. Works great. It just isn't switched on. Who audits and checks? Nobody's checking. And one of the best technology we've got is the telephone, in that you ring up or you look online to see who it is, or you meet someone and you ask if you verify somebody by speaking. And all those things get put to one side, and then we wonder why we have chaos with fraud, and why the fraudsters love doing fraud, because it's so easy when people are off guard or there's a big prize. So that's a bit of a roller coaster thing. I don't like to leave people on the down, so I would say on the positive side, in the last few months we've run 17 of our COVID-19 fraud watch, and I'm seeing friends and colleagues online now. This has really brought people together. I've been so impressed with the response, of where the counter fraud community and the professions, industries that wouldn't have spoken before. Everybody's joined us and sharing intel and information. That's going to the authorities, and they're taking action. So yeah, it could be quicker, could have done other things, but crikey, I wouldn't want to be in Boris Johnson or any of the global leaders and chancellors' shoes at the moment. So a lot of way to go, but gosh, we've really stepped up to the mark and united here. We know there's a major, wave of fraud coming when we start to see who can't pay back, and then how many of those were fraud. But you know what? Actually, we've done a lot of work, and it's not been bad, and that will stand us instead for, we've just written again now, suggesting some other work with banks and the government for the next wave, how we can learn from it. And that letter's just gone, which I'll share with you probably in the next few days when it's published. But a lot of opportunities. But I'd really rather me tell you. If you've got any questions I could answer, or I'll just shut up and let you get on.
Thanks, David. I was remiss at letting everyone know at the start that we would hopefully have a couple of minutes for questions. So while I give everyone a little bit of thinking time, because we've probably only got an opportunity for one question, I had a couple written down. One you've already answered, which was a question around people fraudulently accessing sort of hardship arrangements and government stimulus payments, which I think we've started to see in some countries some conversations around maybe the controls weren't as tight around, because the government was very focused on getting stimulus out, and maybe not all the checks and balances, and making sure that the right people were receiving it. But one of the things I was curious is whether you're starting to see in organisations, and I'm talking corporates here, whether or not you're starting to see any trends or hearing anything around just basic internal controls stopping, now that people are working in a very disconnected way, more so than they ever have before. Is that something that you have started to see or hear, or something you expect may start to come out as we progress further down the COVID timeline?
Yeah, very good question. We haven't got that much hard evidence of it yet. We know there have been some. So some research by CIFAS, our fraud avoidance service, are saying, yeah, insider fraud, and that, as you know, medium to senior level executives, particularly with financial controls and oversight, they're always your danger spot, you know, for all manner of things, applying for loans, running off with the money, getting others to do stuff, not being honest, but they're not getting reported, and they don't tend to get reported until later, or coming out when there's, so I don't think we'll see, but we have heard of that, and it's certainly one to be on guard with looking, because that is always the usually men as well, in my sort of age group, and under pressure. So very much an audit and a controls thing, but not reported, and I wouldn't expect people to do so much yet.
Excellent, thanks, David. I'm just looking to see if there are any questions, and I don't see any hands up, so I'm going to assume that means we have no questions unless Angela or Bev jump in and tell me otherwise, but I certainly can't see any at this stage. So I will then thank you very much, David. I know you have some other commitments, but really appreciate you having joined us. Didn't think I would be hearing about romance fraud when I logged into this call, but a lot of romance going on in this house when you spend 24/7 together, but we won't make any more jokes about that. I certainly appreciate you having joined us, as I'm sure the rest of the participants do as well. Thank you very much for your time and your insights, and enjoy the rest of your day. We will move on. We have a panel discussion scheduled next. So David, we can let you escape if you would like, or you're more than welcome to stay and listen to the panel, but thank you.
Thank you. I'd love to stay, but I do have another session with one of our groups, so I will have to leave. But please, you've got our details, the Fraud Advisory Panel website with all the information on there. And if we can help you, any of the members, don't hesitate to ask. Be a pleasure. And it's not just me. We've got a whole board of some, you know, superb experts, and happy to help in any way we can. So yeah, and good luck with David, the session and the future too. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. So now we're going to move into a high-level panel discussion, and what I'm going to do is I am going to get each of the panelists to introduce themselves briefly. So slightly different to how I think we'd planned it, where you were going to introduce yourselves before each of you spoke, but I figured it would be best if we just run through the list quickly of Sandy first, then Steph, then Paul, and then Ali, and just a brief introduction for each of yourself, 30 seconds, and then we will step through the topics that each of you are going to talk to as well. So if I throw to you first, Sandy.
Sure, thanks, Fiona. Sandy Harrigers. I'm a partner at Deloitte. Been at the firm a little over 30 years, all focused on internal controls and IT controls in particular. My current role at Deloitte is leading global assurance with a specific focus on IT audit quality.
Thanks, Sandy. Steph?
Thanks, Fiona. I'm Steph Renanda. I'm also a partner from Deloitte, from the South Africa member firm. But I'm here today in the role of the chairman of the Over Fraud Task Group, which was run through our Committee for Auditing Standards locally. So, thanks, Fiona.
Thanks, Steph. And Paul? I think, Paul, we have you on camera as well. Do we have you on camera, or are we just sound? I know we had some challenges last time we spoke.
Yeah, I can see you. Can you hear me?
I can see you too. Perfect. Lovely to see you, Paul.
Sure. Hi everyone. My name is Paul Pu. I'm a head of the forensic practice at KPMG in China. I'm a CPA by background. Over the last 20 years, I have been primarily working on fraud investigations, particularly around financial misreporting. I have been working for KPMG for about 15 years, including the time in New York and in Shanghai, China. Very glad to meet with you, everyone.
Thank you, Paul. And Ali. We've got Ali somewhere.
Hello, everybody. I'm Ali Fati. I'm the CEO of MindBridge AI. MindBridge uses machine learning and artificial intelligence to extract data and identify anomalies from financial data. You can call it, we are kind of the MRI of data. I've been a serial entrepreneur. MindBridge is my 7th company, and I had 3 exits before.
Thanks, Ali. So we're going to start with the first person. Introduce yourself. Sandy, you get to go first on your topic, and Sandy's going to talk to us about technology used for fraud procedures in financial audits and some of the benefits and obviously some of the challenges that Sandy's seen as well. So over to you, Sandy.
Great, thanks, Fiona. As Fiona said, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we use technology to address the risk of fraud in our audits. And this really starts with the process we follow to obtain an understanding of the entity and their environment. As part of that, we consider the risk of fraud, including management override. And a key component of that testing is the journal entry testing that we do as part of the audit. When we do this testing, we leverage technology to assist in our getting an understanding of the population. And we also use it to profile the journal entries to identify specific entries with certain characteristics of audit interest. Our journal entry tool is actually integrated with a broader data extraction tool and a series of data analytics that we run as part of the risk assessment process. And this lets us understand the transactions underlying the journal entries and financial reporting, in many cases in real time, in more and more cases in real time. Some of the key activities that we do as we're evaluating journal entries to address the risk of fraud. The first one is we start with the specific focus on risk assessment. And as part of that, we consider where the risk of management override exists within the entity in order to focus our audit procedures in that area. When we're using data analytics, we're using those to support the risk assessment and to identify journal entries that we're going to do additional audit procedures around. And as part of that, we run a series of tests of the journal entries that get customized to the individual client environment based upon the understanding we obtained. There's literally dozens of automated tests that we use, that we complete using data analytics. These are things like we look for unusual accounts. We look for seldom used accounts in the journal entries. We'll look for things like a debit to revenue, which would not be an expected transaction at most entities. We also do keyword searches. So we look for things like the word plug, for example, that might, indicate that a fictitious number is being placed in an account. We also look for duplicate entries, and there's more and more and more of these type of tests that we do in an automated fashion. Once those tests are run and we've profiled the entries, then we actually make selections from those identified entries to do further audit procedures to determine whether the risk of fraud has manifested itself in any of those entries. We've seen significant benefits to our use of technology in the audit, and in particular in this area of fraud detection. And I'm just going to cover a few of those briefly here. The first one is we're able to identify deeper insights through the analysis of actual client data. When you can do a test of the entire population of entries, obviously you're going to get more insights and more information coming out of that than if we just did a sample. We're also able to really narrow in our audit focus on the entries that we think have characteristics of higher risk, which helps us then get more precise in what we're looking at for the audit. It makes the audit procedures faster, because once you've set this process up and you have a fixed way to get client data, you can get it repeatedly over time. We've also seen opportunities where we can now run the analysis on a quarterly basis. So as part of the quarterly review, we may run these tests. That lets us level out the audit work over the year instead of having a big peak of audit procedures to do near year end. And it also just lets us streamline the audit. We can do things much faster, more efficiently when we're running data analytics to identify patterns and anomalies. Beyond journal entry testing, we also run a whole suite of analytics specific to each account balance using technology that helps us do the same thing for every other account balance to streamline the audit, to enhance our risk assessment process, and to narrow down items of audit interest through an analysis of 100% of the population. While the benefits are significant in this process, as with most things, there's also some challenges. So one of the challenges is just getting the data from the entity, particularly if you have a large client that operates in a decentralized way. So you might have a lot of significant components that are running on different systems. In that case, it's much more difficult to go component by component and get the process set up to extract the data, as compared to if you had a large client that's running, one common ERP system across the entity. In that case, it's much easier to get the data set up. We also see challenges sometimes in reconciling the information that we extract from client systems. Pretty much foundational to any audit procedure is if you're using data from the entity, the first step you have to do is verify the accuracy and completeness of that information and tie it right into the financial statements that you're auditing. And in some cases, that can be challenging depending on the complexity of the entity systems. And then the last challenge is in this particular area of fraud detection around the risk of management override. Sometimes it's very difficult to isolate manual journal entries where there may be a higher risk of fraud, typically from the automated journal entries. In many systems, particularly if you have a lot of interfacing systems coming into where the journal entries are stored, in many cases, what is really an automated entry in a source system may come across to the ledger looking like a manual entry. And that makes it difficult then to split those two populations out so you can really focus your testing on manual entries. So those are a few of the challenges. And then last, I just wanted to share one quick example of where we've seen this type of testing bear fruit. And this was at one of our clients where we did the journal entry testing, and as part of our procedures, we were able to identify a journal entry that had kind of wording similar to this, something like, entry made at the direction of Joe Blow. Well, in that case, that seemed like an odd description for a journal entry that popped out of our keyword analysis. And so we selected that item. We had the entity go get the support for us, and there really was no support for that entry. This literally was an entry where somebody was looking to manipulate a key earnings metric. It was determined to be an unsupported entry, and accordingly action was taken by the company, related to the person that had entered this entry. So at the end of the day, these procedures have been fruitful for us in the audit process, and we expect to continue to do more and more of this testing where we're heavily leveraging technology in order to execute the audit.
Thanks, Sandy. Appreciate that. We're going to move now to Steph, who, as she said in her introductory comments, is the chair of the IAASB Fraud Task Group. She's going to be talking to us about the focus on fraud in South Africa in particular, and the guidance that you developed in South Africa. Thanks, Steph.
Thanks, Fiona, and thanks for giving me a few minutes to talk to you about the project which we ran in South Africa. We were tasked with developing some non-authoritative guidance to auditors on our considerations relating to fraud. With my day job as an audit partner, serving both clients as well as our internal quality team, and given the current environment in South Africa, this was a project that I was particularly interested in and excited to get involved in. I guess, I mean, without saying, fraud is prevalent in our country. And in fact, since I've been sitting here on this call, I think I've received about 3 or 4 news alerts relating to tender fraud and corruption. And similar to many countries across the globe, some of our recent issues have definitely increased the public scrutiny on auditors and the role that we play in protecting the public interest, particularly when it comes to fraud. Examples of our issues range from the likes of Steinhoff to accusations and investigations into the state capture of audit firms, with headlines like when good auditors go bad, how the auditors keep dodging the fraud bullet, and why did audit work not pick up corruption in our state carrier. These evidence that the expectation gap within South Africa is big and goes beyond just what we do under the auditing standards. And in some instances, is also questioning whether we as the auditors are complicit in some of the issues. And although I know that's not a topic for today, I think it does highlight that there are definitely broader factors at play in our environment. So in order to try to address some of the public interest concerns, and particularly regarding what our responsibilities are under the standards, we embarked on this project, which really was to provide guidance to practitioners. We also hope that it will provide more clarity to the public on our responsibilities and try and alleviate some of that expectation gap. So we formed a task group to develop the guidance. That task group included audit practitioners from the Big Four, as well as small and medium enterprises. We also made sure that we involved forensic specialists in our public sector audits, and a representative from both our revenue services and financial sector conduct authorities. And we wanted to make sure that a broad range of stakeholders were involved in developing the guidance, in part to get buy-in from those beyond just the audit practice. Before we kicked the project off, there was a lot of interaction with various stakeholders, all of whom agreed that in the short term, this guidance is definitely needed. However, they also believe that in the medium to long term, there is probably a need for more authoritative guidance. This will, however, be dependent on the developments that come out of the IAASB and a lot of these information sessions. So I thought I would give you some highlights of the final document and what it entails. We tried to provide a lot of practical tips and examples to audit practitioners, including guidance on what it really means to be professionally skeptical, how to document our professional judgment, and how to evidence professional skepticism in our files. We encouraged the use of forensic experts throughout the audit, and throughout the document talk about various areas that you can use forensic experts, including fraud discussions with the team, when you're going for fraud inquiries with your clients, and also in the execution of an audit where you've identified that there's a heightened risk of fraud. We then also decided to actually provide practitioners with some forensic interview techniques. So one of the appendices to the document is a list of interview techniques that they themselves can use in the field throughout the audit process to help them to foster that mindset. As I mentioned, we wanted to make sure that the document had a lot of practical examples. So we included a range of fraud risk factors that are particularly prevalent in our environment, some fraud schemes that we've seen in practice, particularly around revenue recognition, as well as additional factors to consider in management override of controls and journal entry testing. We also took the opportunity to remind our practitioners of their responsibilities when fraud is identified, both in our public sector audits and private sectors, as there are slightly differing reporting responsibilities. And we also thought it would be relevant, given the prevalence of fraud at the moment, that we give the practitioners some considerations for their audits when there's an ongoing forensic investigation at a client. So we did give them some of that. This is really just some of the highlights of the document. And I guess in summary, the focus that we had was to provide practical tips and recommendations to assist auditors in the field. It's critical to note that this does not in any way extend our responsibilities, but we hope that it has provided a bit more insight, both to practitioners, but also to the public around what those responsibilities actually entail. So far, the feedback has been positive, And I think it shows that there was definitely a need for some additional guidance. And we hope to develop this project further as we enter sort of medium and long-term views. Thank you, Fiona.
Thanks, Steph. And I'm very impressed with your ability to remain cool, calm and collected with whatever else might have been going on around you. You won an award for that. I'm not sure I would have been able to do that. So well done. Very impressive. Thank you.
We're going to the screaming in the background.
I don't apologize at all. I love it. I think this stuff's fabulous. It shows we're all human. Paul, I think, is next on the list. As he said at the start, he's head of forensics at KPMG in China. He's going to talk to us about what he's seeing in forensic audits today, including how technology is being used to perpetrate and detect fraud, and then maybe some of the differences between forensic audits and financial statement audits, what they do, which is slightly differently. So, Paul, thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. I prepared a couple of slides. Basically to do a brief introduction on the trends in the financial fraud that I have been seeing, and also how we can use technology to detect those fraud, as well as some differences that I can summarize for you between the financial statement audit and the forensic audits. So if I may, over the last 2 decades in my career, I have seen in my own version, I have summarized in basically from version 1.0 to 2.0 to 3.0 type of financial fraud that I have been involving over the last 20 years. So if we see, for example, 20 years ago, the financial fraud was basically pretty basic, like a bill and a hold. Capitalization of those operational expenses, and also we have also see quite often those inappropriate provisions, whether that's warranty expenses or that's accounts receivable, bad debts. Those were the typical financial fraud that would expect, 20 or maybe 15 years ago. So about 10 years ago, at least in China, where I can see, we start to see more complex fraud schemes. So often that will involve round-tripping transactions in order to inflate the sales, but the cost also comes with, sometimes you have to pay a bit of tax in order to recognize those extra revenue or the inflated revenue. And we also see non-disclosed financial related party transactions, and often those related party transactions are not at arm's length. So those were the typical financial fraud in the 2.0 era. But more recently, especially in the last few years, we see more and more often fraudsters are using technology to facilitate their fraud perpetration. For example, we have seen some TMT companies whereby their valuation is largely dependent on the user activities, the active users, etc. So we have seen, direct manipulation of those operational data rather than simply the financial data. And also we have seen very complex designed deals, if you will, in order to get some, fraudulent purposes. For example, we have seen some companies, they have been designing some investments at inflated price. So a lot of those overpriced payments were actually accounted as goodwill, but in fact, those money were actually funded to external parties, which eventually comes into the company in order to reach the round-tripping transactions. So all those fraudulent activities doesn't disappear. It's just that the way or the forms how they were committed at those fraud, it's different. And again, a lot of technology were used. So in terms of the technology that we use, we kind of use the qualitative and the quantitative data analysis. Sandy mentioned a little bit on the particularly the MJE data analysis. We also leverage the different sources of data, not just financial data, but also those operational data and the bank statements, because these days a lot of those bank data are electronically available. And also particularly in China, because all the tax data are readily available in systems, because the government heavily regulated those tax reporting. So a lot of those tax data are available, so we can cross-check those tax data versus those financial reporting as well. So the more data that we have, the more analysis that we can perform. And also don't forget not just the internal data, but also some external data, for example, like corporate registration information, those marketing statistics, etc. Also, we heavily rely on e-discovery technology to analyze those what we call the unstructured data, often from computers, mobiles, email servers, etc. We also have been using machine learning and predictive coding technology in detecting those or identify those evidence from those unstructured data. Next slide, please. I'm conscious that we don't have a lot of time, and I'll briefly mention about the difference between the forensic audit and a financial audit, especially for those who hasn't been dealing with forensic accountants before. This list is not meant to be exhaustive, but rather just to give you some flavor what the differences were, that we have. First of all, as forensic accountant, we are doing forensic investigations or fraud investigations, which is more fact-finding only. We will not provide any audit opinion or other opinion, for example, like a legal opinion. Secondly, our approach is more custom tailored, although there are different common patterns in different frauds. But every company is different, every fraud scheme is different, every people is different. So we have to custom tailor our procedures to address specific issues. And last but not least here is, we leverage more technologies to drive different approaches. I just mentioned on, data analytics and e-discovery, but we focus more than just financial data. Often, if you link those operational data and the financial data, you will have a lot of interesting findings, which I can discuss in further details when we have the group discussions. Last but not least, in forensic audits, we deal with different stakeholders, different people. Sometimes you have the audit committee who have different interests with the management, and also you deal with companies' external audit who were very actively involved in our investigations. They wanted to shadow our work to get understanding of our progress and our findings. We need to strike a balance in terms of managing their expectations whilst we can do an independent investigation. Sometimes we deal with lawyers as well. So really many people that we have to deal with, and also dealing with those whistleblowers, those witnesses as well. So with that, I'll hand over back to Fiona, and we can discuss further details in the group discussions.
Thank you, Paul. We're going to go now to, and it's definitely not last and least, it's save the best till last. We've got Ali, who introduced himself briefly before, and he's going to talk to us about what he's seeing in his line of business related to sort of fraud and technology and some of the recent trends that he's starting to see as well. So over to you, Ali.
Thank you, Fiona. What I really want to discuss in this session, and obviously we can talk later on when we have the group setting, is the use of technology and the mismatch that exists today between what the world is doing versus what the fraudster is doing. If you look in terms of MindBridge, we basically use machine learning and artificial intelligence to look at the data and the raw data and to identify what's hidden inside this data. Call it the MRI of data. And what we have to recognize that if you look at data in general, we have explosion of data. we have 10% of the data is actually structured and 90% is unstructured. And the amount of unstructured data is growing each day. When we look at the tools that are being used by the fraudsters versus the tools that are being used by governments and organizations that are looking at the fraud, there is a huge gap. Why? Fraudsters don't have to worry about legislation. They're going to use the latest technologies that exist. They use deep fake, they use AI, they use synthetic ID, digital twinning, and on and on and on. They use high definition scanners and printers. And when you look at what's happening in the market from that perspective, there is a big concern that the gap is growing. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, just every year they provide a report, and their report to the nation for 2020 identified a stark fact. They maintain that out of the GDP of the world, which was pre-COVID was 85 trillion, 5% or 4.5 trillion are lost to fraud globally. That means it's a tax of 5% of each company on the planet that we are losing to fraud. And the question is, how do we solve that? Because the fraud comes with many meanings. And if you look at, Brian Clark talked about it, you have a variety of elements that are associated with fraud, and what are the tools that we are going to use to address it. Believe it or not, that right now, still 40% of the frauds are being caught by whistleblowers. However, if you look at what internal audit does, what external audit does, the percentages that are being utilized to detect the frauds are single digit. The largest fraud that we see is with financial statement. According to this report by ACFE, it's about close to $1 million for the median range of the losses. So when we want to deal with the technology, we have to really realize that the technology is the one that is going to help us to address this tsunami of data. It's just beyond the ability of any individual to deal with it. If we look, for example, at the size of file that we are dealing with, the average number of transactions that we are dealing with, and these are not the publicly traded companies, is 250,000 transactions. And a transaction can consist of multiple elements within the transaction. So you may have 1,000 actually rows within one transaction. So the numbers that you're dealing with could be in the millions. Now, if you have to look at it manually, clearly it's not plausible, it's not feasible to really look at it. And the issue that exists is, again, the mismatch with the tools and standards that exist today and the methodologies to enable us to utilize the latest technology in order to fight the fraud. What we do at MindBridge, we use the AI to digitize the cognitive processes of human to enhance the organization capabilities to detect fraud, to do it faster without really human intervention as much. The whole notion is that the tool that we're providing is going to help the individual auditor, the individual forensic auditor, to augment their capabilities to understand the financial data. And when we look at what happened in, for example, when you compare existing tool versus the AI, we have the efficacy of the AI is so much more significant. And we did studies where we took just a normal rule-based activity, and then we took the AI, and the differential is about 1,000 to 1, up to 1,000 to 1, where you can detect faster. So the efficacy of AI and machine learning is a lot faster. Now, the segregation of duties is probably one of the biggest problem of fraud. And again, AI, if you utilize it, and Paul mentioned the notion of looking at beneficiary, look at e-discovery, looking at other things that could be done, and the segregation of duty, when you utilize AI, will enable you to get some of these fighting chances against the fraudsters that are utilizing the latest technology. If they are going to use a Porsche and we're using a car that is a lot less powerful, it's very difficult to catch up with them. But there are challenges to the utilization of AI adoption. And I think that Sandy mentioned that in the beginning. When you look at it, access to data, garbage in, garbage out. Right now, you talk about data lake versus data swamp. Companies that have all of the technology in multiple locations that are not easy to communicate and extract. If you cannot get it, the data become a data swamp, not a data lake. If you look at the issues, again, Sandy mentioned a digital transformation. Do companies have access to not only the structured data, but rather to the unstructured data? Can you get access to invoices? And can you verify, for example, I know that Thomson Reuters utilizes confirmation in order to do it automatically to get the confirmation of the data. So it's not done manually. So the things that you need to do is the automation and the ability to extract data in a digital format so that you can really understand it across the whole organization. There is the other issues related to utilization of technologies are the lack of analytics knowledge that exists currently, and this is changing. COVID obviously changed a lot of it, and where digital transformation, people used to, and companies used to look at 5 years horizon, now they were forced to do it in few months. So we're going to see more of that done. Of course, there is the issues of management support and support across the organization. One of the problems with adopting AI-based application is that people treat it as if it is a tactical change. A technical change is what we do, for example, for Netflix. We used to have video that we rent, and now we are streaming it. So that's a technical change. But when you look at women and emancipation, that took 60 years to go through the system. So the same thing here, if you look at adopting AI-based application, if you're going to look at it from that perspective, you have to consider that you have to follow the life cycle of a technology. And you start with high expectation, you look at the realization that there is a lot of effort and that it's complex. And unless you have the support from the whole company, all the way from the CEO and the board, all the way to the lower level, you ended up in a valley of death where people say it's too complicated, we're going to abandon. And then you have uncertainty and basically frustration. And it's only when you have the whole company supporting it that you can see the light of the end of the tunnel, and you can see, how did I do it without it before? So that's another area that you have to be concerned with. And finally, at the standards, if you look at the ISA 240, what you're going to see that the standard clearly says you have to find out all and investigate all issues and all anomalies. But in the reality, because of the current tools and technologies, utilization of sampling and current tools, you're really supporting the spirit of the standard, but not the actual intent, which is find everything. And the only way to find everything is to look at the raw data, read it all, 100% of it, and take action on it. And this is what AI can do. So from the comment that I would like to present is the fact that fraudsters are using the latest technologies and the latest tool to commit fraud. And it is time for the industry to upgrade our tools and standards, both in order to align our intent with the current technologies and utilize them to fight the fraud with the best tools that we have on the market. And the call to action that I'm talking about is it's up to us, individuals, regulators, the standard bodies, and the companies and the academia to move us to the 21st century and allow us the fighting chance against the fraudsters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellie, and appreciate everyone. It's been just a little over an hour, and I'm sure that you're ready for a bit of a break, stretch the legs before we come back. For those of you who are watching us on YouTube, we're going to have a 10-minute break, and then when we return, we're going to be going into individual breakouts. So for everyone who is going to be participating in those breakouts, please obviously come back and join us again after the 10-minute break, and then you'll be transferred into your breakout rooms, which Angela will talk us through once you all come back. But for those on YouTube who are following along, you'll be seeing a break, sort of a countdown clock. So you'll know that when we're done in the breakout groups, we will then be streaming live again when we report back on what's been covered off in the breakout. So we're going to do a 10-minute break now. According to my clock, that will mean, mine says 10:05 my time, so sorry, that's not helpful for anyone else in different time zone, but in 10 minutes time, so when there's 15 minutes past the hour, we will start back. So thank you very much. Enjoy your 10-minute break. For those on YouTube, we will see you again in a little around an hour's time. Thank you. Give everyone a minute to join back before we get our instructions on moving into the breakouts.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we have everyone back. So welcome back after the break. Angela, I'll pass to you to briefly describe the breakout sessions and how they're going to work. There are going to be moderators and staff presenters at each of them. So I would sincerely like to thank my IAASB board colleagues, Josephine and Bob, and staff being Billy and Brett, and then a number of other staff who are going to be probably the slaves taking lots of notes in each of those breakouts. Thank you very much for being voluntold into the positions as moderators, and you will have a job to do to report back as well. So Angela, if you'd just like to go through the logistics, please.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Fiona. So we're going to break into these smaller breakout sessions for the next 45 minutes. There will be participants as well as observers in each of the rooms, and you'll be automatically routed into those breakout sessions. So you shouldn't have to click any buttons or do anything. We should be doing all that for you on the back end. If for any reason you are not automatically routed into a breakout session, just stay where you are in the main room, and we'll work on our end to make sure that we manually place you into the breakout room. So we'll be doing that for the next 45 minutes, and then we'll automatically come back to the main room, and then we'll do a debrief from there. So thank you, and look forward to seeing you all when we come back.
Thanks. So yeah, 45 minutes, then we'll take a 10-minute break, which during those 10 minutes, if the moderators and their staff can work out what the key messages are going to be, please keep them to a couple of minutes, the highlights, so that we can do a reasonably quick debrief. And then we're trying to allow as much time as possible, hopefully about 25 minutes for an open discussion and Q&A once the moderators have reported back on each of the groups. So that's the process. Okay. I assume I will see my people in breakout room A. So I think most of you probably had the same issue we had. We were so excited and so enthralled in the conversation, we got dragged out of the breakout room. So we've got a 10-minute break. We're going to start back at 10 minutes past, well, it's 11 for me. It'll be 10 minutes past 9 for those in the US. We'll start back in 10 minutes. And apologies for those of you who are mid-sentence who got hooked out of the room. Sorry.
Yeah, that happened in our group as well.
I think it happened in every group. So, so apologies.
No, that's fine.
Okay, I'm hoping that everyone has had their break and is rushing back, very excited to hear the debriefs, hopefully. See if we've got everyone back I'll check that we've got the moderators. We've got Bob, that's a good start. Josephine, have we got you back?
I'm here, yep, sorry.
Oh, there we go, excellent. And we've got Billy, have we got Brett? Hopefully, no. He's last there. Oh, there we go, he's waving. Thank you. I think we've got everyone back. So the great thing about being moderator means I don't have to actually do any work. I can get other people to do it. So they've contacted me to work through what the key points were going to be. And I thought, fabulous, you can share the fabulous key points, Bev. But before we do that, I did want to say, and apologies again, you all got hooked out of your discussion. I'm sure if you were anything like our group, you didn't get through all of the questions, and we probably could have talked for hours longer and still not have got through all of the questions. But I was going to say to everybody who was participating, first of all, thank you. But more importantly, just ask, hopefully it's okay that we can stay connected with each of you. I think there was a lot of really rich stuff that we really only got to touch the surface of. So I think as we are starting on the journey, this is great input, but I think we'd like to touch back again with a number of you just to delve a little deeper in some of the topics we've heard about. So as we progress on this, once we've done the feedback sessions from each of the groups, from the moderators of those groups, if there was anything else that you would really like us to know or think about or have on our radar as an IAASB as we sort of embark on this journey, then if you'd like to start prepping what those things would be so that we can cover that off in the spare time that we have at the end. But on that note, I will throw to Bev just to cover off the highlights of what we covered in Group A. Thanks, Bev.
Thanks, Fiona. So I think there were a couple of major points that came through. The first is around the actual frauds themselves, and there's two main types of frauds, and we know about them. There's the frauds in the financial statements or the financial reporting, and then there's the misappropriation of assets. The financial statement frauds are bigger by number, but far less occurrence of it, whereas the misappropriation of assets are on average much smaller frauds, but they're much more prevalent. So it's really making sure that we remember that there are the two types of frauds and that the auditors are really looking and considering both kinds. And even although the misappropriation of assets may not have been as, or maybe occurring as often, but smaller, I think the COVID environment has really exacerbated some of the issues, and we discussed some of the sort of ways that these frauds could be perpetrated. You've got new working environments. Applications are being used that are untested. So just thinking through what the differences are in the current environment. We talked a little bit around the actual auditing standard 240 and thinking through what some of the changes were that were different today and which accounts are actually being affected, which may have been a little bit different to what had been thought about when 240 first came in about 15 to 20 years ago. So at that time, they identified revenue recognition, journal entries, over out of control. And then we just thought a little bit around, maybe some of that has changed and maybe we need to be looking in different places with respect to the auditing standard. And then with regard to the forensic auditing, we spoke a little bit around how technology really can be used to try and identify areas of where forensic auditors could look. But then we were reminded or given a very good old-fashioned sort of questioning and looking at documents and using professional skepticism really does help. So I think that does make it very similar to audit in that way. Probably the biggest difference between audit and forensic auditing is they actually go in with the mindset of we're looking for something. So it's been flagged in some kind of way. So we talked a little around some of those sort of techniques to identify using technology where the frauds could be, but then remembering that you still need to come in as a sort of and do those people skills, questioning people around documents, what happened, those kinds of things. So I think with that, Fiona, I will hand back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Bev. And now you all know why I don't bother to do these sorts of things, because Bev was always going to do a much better report back of our group's discussion. Thanks, Bev. I'm going to pass to Bob next, and then after Bob, it'll be Josephine, just to give you the heads up of the order. But Bob, you were Group B, I believe.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. And following Bev always puts the pressure on, but I'll do my best to organize some thoughts. We had a great discussion, and obviously some of this overlaps between the different areas. So I'll just share the main points. I think overriding thought, kind of agreed to with our group, is that generally we need to be more forward-looking. I think Miklos put it in terms of we have to do less shooting the wounded and more being able to look forward, identify risks, and identify what might be happening out there. And in that connection, I think one of the great suggestions was that work needs to be done to assemble or accumulate a database of frauds that could be used where characteristics were understood and kind of could be used to be more forward-looking and predictive in that way. Specifically with respect to technology to perpetrate fraud, one of the overriding themes, I guess, was that COVID-19, the pandemic, the stay-at-home has really changed the way business and a lot of is transacted. There's just not a lot of face-to-face things, so you see more transactions being conducted over social media, Facebook, things like that, where there's certainly ripe with opportunity to duplicate identities, fictitious addresses for deliveries, payment information, so on and so forth. With respect to technology being used by auditors, again, coming back to, it'd be great to have a database of common frauds. I think we did talk about some use of machine learning, particularly with respect to use of unstructured data. Where, for example, I believe KPMG is doing some work where they collect information, employee information, customer information, use that to drill down into ownership of employees and other companies, related parties, bringing that all together to be able to spot anomalies or areas that just look unusual. So using those external information sources. And then we identified a real barrier, which I think we hit upon in the first general session today, is really around the acquisition of data. And we talked about there's a new technology, or Engine B, I believe it was referred to, which does some data translation tool to try to standardize data among and between different sources and things like that. So that's a real barrier or challenge, I should say. And an area that I think we kind of agreed really nobody had a great answer to was how you deal with accuracy and completeness of data, particularly unstructured when it comes from external sources. But the more analysis that can be done among and between internal information and external information, financial versus operational, those sorts of things certainly seems to be more effective use of technology in that realm. And then I just close off, I guess, by saying, we asked the question about, are there other sources or other places that the IAASB should be looking as we kind of embark upon this project? And I thought one great suggestion that came forth from Steph was to actually work with revenue departments, tax departments in countries and get information or work with them on their analysis of tax evasion and fraud cases. If it's being used for fraud, it likely could be used for financial statement fraud also. So to look there, and then academia, of course, and other commercial software providers would be good sources for us. So great discussion. Thanks to everyone in my breakout group, and back to you, Fiona.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate that. Josephine, breakout group C.
Yes, again, we had some really interesting discussions. And we sort of bounced around a bit with the questions, so I'll just probably cover up some of the key points that came out of that, if I can, Fiona. And as Bob says, thanks again to all my participants. In terms of question one, whilst we are seeing emerging use of RPI and AI by clients, one of the things that the participants said, that as well as being a positive in terms of emerging technology, when you have less people around, then it gives you the issue or raises issues in respect of collusion or segregation of duties. So it's sometimes important to, be more open-minded about new and emerging technologies at the client and what those risks might be. And there was also a general warning as to whether the material fraud focus or the focus and the standards on material fraud remains appropriate given some of the cases that we come across and on whether that's actually in the public interest. So food for thought there. In terms of audit teams, there are some very sophisticated tools being developed. Our participants talked about, including machine learning over entire populations with AI being used to detect anomalies. But we also talked a little bit more about what is emerging that's important, that's not about technology. And Bev touched on this earlier in terms of the skill sets of the individuals. Do they really have a sufficient understanding of the entity that are coming through, and whether we might need to think about data scientists in the future given all the changes in technology. So that was quite useful to that question. We also covered the of what else we might need to think about, and we talked again about better skills in identifying criteria when finding anomalies. There were some examples. I think Julia mentioned quite an interesting one which we probably have all been guilty of, where we put in the bank holidays and transactions over bank holidays. But of course, with the shared service centres, then there'll be quite a few outliers coming through whilst that particular area is not celebrating the same bank holiday. So you need to be a lot smarter about those anomalies. Interesting point coming through from Kelly that data itself does actually tell you a story, which is of course true, but it's not necessarily evidence per se, and it's not necessarily obvious then to audit teams how they can actually use that in the audit. How does that fit into the audit process? It's about really what is the credit we can get from that data and the work that we've got from that data and that story that we've now understood. So that was quite helpful for us to think about as a board in terms of our research. Another point was that there tends to be a focus on journal entries, as part of 240 requirements, but there are other areas that auditors might need to focus on using technology, such as, sweeping of cash balances and the extant ISA 600, the non-significant components. Maybe there's some areas there where fraud could be perpetrated, but we don't necessarily think that through. And then we had an interesting discussion about looking at the picture as a whole in terms of some of the corporate frauds and failings in terms of audit in that area, and having a much better idea of the post-mortem of some of these cases, particularly, Enron and then Wirecard as that comes through, really understanding what happened there and whether or not technology could have helped us as auditors or as a profession in actually finding those issues before they became such a massive corporate scandal in the end. So that was actually quite a good thought. Instead of just getting bits and pieces, maybe look at these as a whole picture, some of these particular scandals and dig deeper scandals and see how technology could have helped us as a whole. And yeah, that was it from us. Obviously, I did say we've got lots of other information which Angela has written down, so we can use that.
Excellent. Thanks, Josephine. I think, Vili, you were Breakout Group D, if my notes were right.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you, Fiona. And similarly, in our group, to Josephine's group, the distinction between the questions got a little bit blurred, but we had a very good overall discussion. So I'll also just touch on the main themes that came out of the discussion. I think we actually started our discussion very much where the panel discussion ended before the break, and that is around the gap between the tools that fraudsters are using and the tools that all of the rest of us are using. And that gap will probably always be there, but we need to work together within the ecosystem. And I think that was one of the main themes that came out, is that, again, no player in this ecosystem on their own will succeed to close that gap, will succeed to address the risks. It is management, together with the auditor, together with those charged of governance, together with the regulator, everybody needs to work together. And obviously, technology can be a great enabler in all of that. I think another thing that came out very strongly is that when you look at the frauds that are being perpetrated, it's not new. A lot of the frauds that we see, even the big ones that are grabbing the headlines, still get back to very traditional frauds, very traditional things people do to manipulate, to deceive, to conceal. And therefore, there is an element also of, we also still need to be focused on doing the basic things right. And those basic things that we need to do right, again, would be on the company side in terms of how they set up their control system. I think there was a thought as well that technology enables a company to be much more thoughtful in how they set up their control systems, their programmed controls, being more thoughtful in some of the logic tests they build into their systems. But similarly on the auditor side, doing the basic things right, doing what the standards ask you to do. And then again, layering technology onto that and saying, but we can be more thoughtful in what we do, using the capabilities of technology, and also a very strong sense that technology allows us to engage, as auditors, engage much more directly with the data. We can get much more direct information and evidence from the data, but also understanding, and I think someone else mentioned the whole notion of that the data tells a story, but it's again about seeing all of that in the context of a bigger picture, in the context of an environment where you need to stand back almost and ask yourself, but is what I've seen, is it making sense? Does it look right? Does it fit together? And it's that type of attitude and those type of questions that we need to start to ask. Then I think what came into our conversation quite strongly as well is that clearly technology is a great enabler because it can help us to look for things in a much more focused way. It allows us to deal with large volumes of information, and from those volumes of information, we can identify characteristics, exceptions, anomalies, etc. And that way, we can actually be very focused in our approach. But all of this is also, there's an underlying factor of human behavior. In the discussion, it came out that, you know, from a forensic perspective, you must remember that a fraudster is out to manipulate, is out to deceive, is out to conceal. And we also need to be able to be aware of the telltale signs of that, to be alert to that. And that goes a little bit to skill set. Are we good enough at also understanding human behavior that interacts with the technology? Do we have the skill set to ask the right questions? So there's also very much a component of education, training to all of that. And I think all of that sort of came together. And then I think what I want to close with out of our group was a very strong message that, and I wrote it down exactly as it was said, we need to own our responsibility regarding fraud. Thank you, Fiona.
Thanks, Willie. Appreciate your summary. Brett, you were the last breakout group, I think, Group E.
Thanks, Fiona. Yeah, we had a good discussion in our area. I won't harp on everything. I think some of it is echoed by earlier comments. But maybe just a couple of things that I'm not sure have been picked up so much. So in terms of technology used to perpetrate fraud, people focused on opportunities that were created and where those opportunities existed. And very much it was around changes in company systems, transfers of data between system A and system B, particularly if you've had a merger and the systems may not talk very well to each other. We had a little bit of a discussion as well about in-house apps. And when the company has developed its own applications for whatever purpose, particularly if those have been developed under an agile or a continuous improvement approach, so the changes are happening very rapidly to the software. You know, the software might have changed numerous times and the auditors only come in at a certain point, creating an opportunity for manipulation. There was also a comment that forgeries can be hard for the auditor to prove. You know, there could be something that's been red flagged through audit tools and technology, but it's not actually clear to the auditor at the time whether or not it's actually a forgery or not. So they're unclear as to how to proceed. Big focus on skill sets. Auditors need the right skill sets to be able to understand the technology, and also for clients to be able to understand what anti-fraud measures there may already be in the technology that they've bought that they may not have actually gone to the trouble of switching on. So moving on to technology used by auditors, couple of really key points here. Data integrity was a big focus in this area. You know, a lot of discussion about, you know, making sure that the tools you're using can be deployed to, you know, to really try to make sure that the data that you're getting is correct and accurate in the first place. Lots of discussions about people moving things to Excel and then working off the Excel version. And the point was made that Excel is like the easiest thing in the world to manipulate the data before it gets to the auditor. And so obviously taking the information from the core system would be important. A couple of people talked about variations on the theme of establishing a baseline for the data. So where the data, you know, it's potential for fraud to be happening on top of fraud. So it's actually not clear what the non-fraud version of the company transactions looks like. There was a bit of a discussion about, you know, it would be great if you could share data sets between clients and between firms so that, you know, you had a better starting point to work out where the frauds were, you know, what were fraud indicators, and also where frauds had actually happened. And, you know, there was a point made that that's very difficult due to client confidentiality rules. Just very quickly wrapping up, we spoke a little bit about the last piece around, you know, what tools and technology are used in forensic audits. You know, probably the main thing that came out of that was about combining data from different sources, you know, emails, transaction records, voice, and seeing where that could take us. Also discussion about data standardization, such as open banking standards that would allow, you know, data to be extracted in a way that the auditors could manipulate. Lastly, just on the very last question, a couple of questions more than I suspect comments. One was around what do investors want and what are they willing to pay for? And lastly, a question or a comment about how prevalent technology is for clients from either developing nations, smaller firms, and whether or not, you know, some of these advanced tools would even be effective at all because so much of their data is not digitized. I think that's it from me. Thank you very much.
I'm exhausted. Thanks, Brett. Not because of what you said, but just listening to all of the rich conversation that's been going on in the breakout groups. And in the perfect world, it'd be great for everyone to hear everyone's conversations, but that was never going to work. We've got to the exciting part of the agenda where you don't have to listen to me anymore. And panelists are all done, presenters are all done. We've done the hard work of the breakouts. Now's your opportunity for it's a bit of an open forum discussion. If there's anything that you still want to raise with us, anything you feel really important, we need to make sure this is on our radar as an IAASB. The technique we will use is if you're not familiar with Zoom, which I'm sure all of you are, given how much you've all been in lockdown and using these technologies, but on the when you click on participants, you'll see underneath everyone's names, but you'll see a little blue hand which says raise hand. So if you click on that, that will then pop you to the top of the list so that I can see that you've got something to say. Otherwise, managing 51 people all talking at the same time will be quite challenging for me. So again, this is everyone's opportunity for anything else they wanted to share with us, any questions. The discussion can continue that you might have been having in your breakout group if you wanted to do that as well. I will open it up. Brian, thank you for being first. Someone's always got to go first, don't they? So you get to go first. Thank you very much for volunteering. I didn't even have to pick on you to pick you out.
No worries, as Willie knows. I'm happy to throw it out there and we can maybe see where the discussion goes. But as a CPA, and I worked for Ernst & Young and then PricewaterhouseCoopers, and then I started confirmation.com 20 years ago. I absolutely love our profession. I think what we do is very honorable. In the US, we call it a CPA. and the P stands for the public. And we have to remember that that's really who we're there to represent. We're not hired guns for the company that hired us. And we've got to take, as Billy said, we've got to take our responsibility to find fraud seriously. And I know that as I hear all the discussions, so many of them, we blur the lines between employee theft and management fraud. We're not in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the Financial Times because somebody stole some cash out of the petty cash drawer or because of some segregation of duties fraud. We're getting a bad name in the public because Wirecard, Luckin Coffee, Parmalat, HealthSouth, billion-dollar frauds that management perpetrates. So let's start with the big rocks. Sure, I want to solve catching all fraud, but let's start with the ones that are giving our profession a bad name. And that's really the ones that we've got to focus on, because my concern is if we don't, we will lose our exclusive right to do financial audits. And eventually the regulators and the public are going to say, if you all can't do this correctly, and I think Brett just mentioned the question, what do investors want and what are they willing to pay for? The third question is, what are they willing to sue for? And so we've got to take our responsibility seriously, because otherwise you'll have a Google audit or an Apple audit or an IBM audit or an Ant audit. We will lose that exclusive right if we can't start doing a better job. The ACFE, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, the information says we catch fraud, external auditors, 4% of the time. We're worse than an accident. Accidents catch almost double the amount of frauds. 96% of the time, we're missing the fraud. What are the short sellers doing? I said this in our breakout session. We have access to the financial statements, the underlying financial statements, the systems, management, and the facilities. Short sellers are finding the frauds and they don't have access to any of that. We've got to start doing a better job. The public's counting on us.
And I knew that we would get some hands up. Thank you very much, Brian, for generating some discussion. Ali, I think your hand went up first. I think you're still on mute. There we go.
Thank you, Fiona. To carry on what Brian continue on his theme, the question that we have to address in terms of the big rock, yes, one of the big rock are the big executives that are doing that. But in line with that, we also have another big rock. And the big rock that I'm talking about is, when are we going to be able to have the regulations, the standards to catch up with the technology that exists today? If we look at the current way that we are doing audits, we are still using rule-based system and we're still using sampling. And clearly with the amount of data that exists today, with 90% of the data being unstructured, and having fraudster access to a deep fake, to digital twinning, to high-speed scanners and printers, all synthetic ID, all of these tools that they have that we know of, and they can utilize tools that are not standard, and they have this access. When are we going to have the regulation adapt to the new technology and change the way that we are doing and insist that data, which is the core of, and start to look at the data as a whole and try to get 100% of the data and utilize what's inside the data to give insights to the auditor, the better tools for the auditors. Because right now, the way that the audits is structured, it's limiting the auditors from doing the job. The way that the regulations are being done and presented is basically to enable the auditor to meet the spirit, but not the full intent. If we want to find every problem, every fraud, every anomalies, we need to allow the auditor to do 100% testing. And at this point in time, it is not. So we really need to change. It's not only the regulation, we need to educate the students. We have to get right at the college. We have to educate everybody. And analytics is here to stay, and we have to build on it. So my really call to action and question is, when are we going to adopt the way that we are doing, and we are instructing the auditors. We are basically having their hands tied behind their back and let them go to war with not the full tool set that they can have. And I think that we need to change that.
Thanks, Ali. Appreciate the comments. Roger, your hand was up next.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. I just wanted to mention that I really like how eloquently Brian put it. And another elephant in the room here is the fact that the auditor can be restricted by the audit fee and the procedures and the work that are required to be conducted, and if it can fit within the fee. And so therefore, I'm suggesting that the sort of forensic or fraud emphasis for testing we're talking about today needs to be mandated so that there's not a choice of the extent of testing or the extent of audit procedures. It's actually mandated that a certain XYZ of procedures need to be done so that the client who may be committing financial statement fraud is not restricting the auditor in that sense.
Thanks, Roger. Anyone else? Julia, your hand. Oh, Julia's hand is, yeah, went up and then it went down and now it's gone up and down again, but I'm assuming Julia wants to talk.
Hi, and I just wanted to talk a little bit to come back on the idea of the current standards, because it's an area that at the FRC we've talked about a bit, and when we've been doing, from a practical perspective, looking at the auditor's use of technology from an AQR perspective, we actually found that practitioners were not pointing to specific areas of the standards that were stopping them doing things that they wanted to do, and that standards, there needed to be some discussion and some interpretation, but it wasn't, the standards weren't a blocker as such. Now, following on from that, colleagues in our audit and assurance team have been doing some outreach with the market in the UK, looking to see whether there are areas of standards that the market would like us to look at. And that piece of work is just going through collation and moderation at the moment. So there should be something more coming out from us in the relatively near future on that side. So we are engaging, but we haven't been pointed to areas where people have said these are absolute blockers once we talk through the standards and get some kind of common understanding. I think the terminology that is used is really important. We talk to people quite often about vocabulary, and you know, not every anomaly is an exception, and being careful to understand that. But I mean, that's a debate that we're keen to continue to have, and to understand where people think the blockers are, so we can look at it in more detail.
Thanks, Julia. Kelly. Hi, Kelly. Divine.
Yeah, hi, Fiona. Thank you. So I just wanted to follow on from a couple of the comments that were just made as it relates to, you know, what is in the data, and the auditors moving towards this big data world, and the auditors need to evaluate that data and reduce our sampling risk. And whether there would be a move, and I understand that that's not the IAASB, but a move to have data be part of the audit, that management is required to provide the data. That serves as both a deterrent to fraud, because they, you know, obviously understand that we're going to be looking closely and differently and through different lenses, but also gives us that ability to do the analysis that we need to do. So you know, that is one of the things that we do encounter is some level of pushback as to whether they will give us what it is that we need to do to accomplish this new world.
Thanks, Kelly. We have another hand up. Martin Duffels, is he? Martin?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hello.
Thank you. I think very much I can appreciate comments about using data. I think all in all, the data is representing what is actually going on. And I think focusing alone on data isn't the answer either. So I would really argue that data as such isn't the answer. It is the combination of interpreting data in relation to the company's financial statements, and then that focus that was mentioned before on what are the public interest duties of auditors, and that relates to finding a fraud and finding other errors that are material to the financial statements. So I think it is important to keep that role constantly in mind. And yes, certainly data can be helpful, but it is not the solution in its own. And data can also be deceiving at times, if you will. So I also want to emphasize that caution in this regard. Thank you.
Thanks, Martijn. I'm not seeing any blue hands, but that can't possibly be right. I'm confident there's some more people. Oh, Wayne Basford from Australia. Nice to see you. You're up. Wayne, you're still on mute if you're trying to talk. I can see your hand up. You're not on mute anymore. Thank you.
I can talk. I'll echo what I was talking in our breakout group, and absolutely supporting where Brian's gone. If we were a profession, if we worried about audit quality and audit failure, if a plane crashes, if a 737 MAX falls out the air, every aerospace, all the regulators worry, why did that Boeing fall out of the air? We have all these massive audit failures, billions of dollars, and somehow we keep on ignoring them. You know, my practice, I look at audit failures. I spend my most 90% of my practice these days looking at audit failures. I'm bound by confidentiality. They're all court cases, etc. But the profession, the large firms, we just keep ignoring the fact we're doing something wrong. And, you know, echoing everything that Brian said earlier, if we don't have proper inquiries over every, you know, these are pies, these are billion-dollar failures on London, on the ASX, we're going to lose relevance and credibility.
Thanks, Wayne. We have 3 more blue hands, which is probably going to take us right through to time. So we'll go with Paul first, and then it will be Miklos, and then we'll start with Paul first.
All right, thanks, Fiona. Actually, what I was just trying to say is a little bit similar to what Wayne was talking about, but perhaps from the other perspective. I have been practicing as auditors for a few years before I turned my career into forensic accountant. So being able to see both sides of the profession, I understand, you know, sometimes it's not always easy for auditors to catch up those frauds. First of all, it's the company that if they prepare, circumvent the controls and colluded with each other, no controls will work. And also as auditors, you know, do they really have access to a lot of the data that we have access to? For example, the operational data, the tax data, the financial data. Very few companies will be willing to provide those data to auditors. Perhaps financial can be provided, but operational data is often kept as top secret. And even though when we do forensic fraud investigations, it takes weeks, if not months, to complete those jobs. And some of those large engagements could take years. So the level of efforts put out there for fraud investigations is certainly different to financial audits. So there should be a fine line in terms of what the auditor's responsibility is in terms of fraud risks. But I personally, I'm not in a position to say, you know, where the fine line is, but sometimes I feel a little bit empathy to our audit colleagues, whereby, you know, they have a lot of other things to do, but, you know, certain fraud was really committed by the top management, whereby no control basically can detect that, you know, and also can prevent that. And also remember is, you know, talking about technology, etc. Fraudsters are perhaps always one step or maybe half step ahead of the auditors or the forensic accountants who are trying to catch them. So normally you would have those fraud schemes first, then you would have think of those preventive, you know, procedures for things like that. So just my two, you know, very preliminary thoughts as we are discussing this topic.
Thanks, Paul. Miklos, you were next.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a few comments. First, I think we should turn our examination of fraud into a more predictive manner. Try to not find a fraud that happened in the past. Second, I think that just looking at the big frauds is that what causes the press, but is not what drains the resources of the company. The third thing I say always is the rules for Uber. The rules for taxes are not good for Ubers. The rules for the traditional regulation is not very good for this modern society. We need to kind of create a dual path of examination and tools. And the third thing I would like to say, and I have many other ones, but I'm going to stop here, is we really need to embed tools in the operational tools. Many companies are using external variables, exogenous variables in many things they're doing in marketing, in recommended models, and etc. We need to put our fraud detection and audit tools embedded together with those and use the same data source. So I'm going to stop here because I have too many comments.
Thanks, Miklos. By all means, other comments you have, feel free to provide them to us offline, because I'm sure there'll be others that have comments as well, and we're going to run out of time to hear all of them. But thank you for those comments, Miklos, and appreciate you joining us. The next hand was, I'm going to say the name wrong, and I apologize. Is it Naoto?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
I butchered your name. I apologize.
Yeah, it's my name is Naoto. Yeah, thank you for the taking care of the pronunciation. So from my point, I would like to add one more comment about the how we can eradicate the fraud. And when we think of that kind of things, I think accounting standard also matters, because I think some accounting standard fraudster can leverage to manipulate the P&L easier than others. So that when we think about the how easily the fraudsters can leverage the accounting standard, think about the entire kind of ecosystem of the accounting standard and audit standard as well. So, and also when it comes to the application of the data analytics or anomaly detection or continuous auditing, also accounting standard matters. Some accounting standard, like estimation, it is hard to apply the automated way of audit, because the subjective or subjectiveness is the things we need to kind of consider. So that traditionally, the estimation is getting more is increasing in the accounting standard, but that makes the audit more difficult and more difficult to apply the analytics or continuous auditing. So in the era of the 21st century and in the era of data analytics or continuous auditing, maybe we need to think about the accounting standard as well. So that's my comment.
Excellent, thanks, Nato. The more the merrier that can help solve this would be my suggestion. So thank you for that. I did want to check, Fran. I noticed a yellow hand went up. I wasn't sure if you were waving at me trying to get my attention, or if you were not able to raise the blue hand. I know some people on iPads don't have quite the same functionality, so I thought I'd just give you an opportunity as well. Was there something you wanted to add?
It was just a point that followed on from what Paul was saying, really, around the degree of deception. And from a practitioner's point of view, you know, the level of deception even when you know where you're looking, can make it very difficult to find the full extent of the issues. And one of the aspects that we've not really touched on is the deterrent effect on senior management in some of these high-profile cases. I'm just minded to refer to, you know, some of the legislation around misleading the auditor, which historically has been pretty unsuccessful at achieving prosecutions, and I wonder whether that's another angle that might be worthy of some additional focus.
Thanks, Fran. And I know, Brian, you've still got your hand up, and there are other people signaling, and we're going to run out of time very quickly. So I do apologise for people we didn't get to. But as I said, please send comments offline if you've still got comments. I will try to wrap it up as quickly as I can and then pass to Tom, who will make the closing comments. But I did firstly want to thank each and every one of you who's joined us today. You've given very freely of your time and your expertise and your insights to help us at the IAASB sort of understand with much more colour and detail the issues surrounding this topic. So I really appreciate it. And I did want to say thank you very much for all of your time, energy and effort. As I said, stay tuned. We're unlikely to let you totally escape. We may well be connecting in with a number of you offline. But if there is anything that you think of or something, as soon as we finish the call, you go, oh, I really meant to tell them this or raise this issue, please, by all means, you've got contact details for many of us, so feel free to reach out. Secondly, I'd like to thank the panelists, and I know we ran out of time to ask them lots of really hard-hitting questions, but I'm sure that none of them would mind if you reached out to them offline with your really hard questions that you were saving up for them. But very much huge thank you to our panelists and our keynote speaker for being willing to, again, prepare for these sessions. I know that is time consuming on top of your day job, and then sharing your expertise as well with us. Finally, and definitely not least, I would like to thank a massive thanks to Beverly Bellman and Angela Donnelly in particular. You can imagine how much work goes into trying to create these events and then get all of the right people involved, and an enormous amount of work has gone on behind the scenes to try and make me look good as a moderator, which they've done a fabulous job of course, but it can't be underestimated. It's quite admin intensive, but also an enormous amount of work. So thank you again to Beverly and Angela for all of the fabulous work that they've done. This is the beginning of the journey, so I'm sure you have not seen the last of any of us on this topic. And I'll hand over to Tom to do the formal closing. So thank you.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you for your willingness to chair this roundtable, and thanks to all the breakout groups and the breakout group chairs for managing the discussion. I thought that the last half hour was so rich conversation, and where it leads me to is there is a lot for us to do on this project, and that technology is clearly both an enabler, but also a challenge for us to confront going forward. And if we think about this in terms of technology by itself, we'll be lost, because it's really when technology is married in the proper way by human intervention that you gain the most insights, and we could improve public trust in the work of audit and assurance. And so I think that really is our task going forward. And this really has become the first seeds of what I expect to be a growing area of exploration for us. So thank you, and I hope we could call upon all members, all participants in this roundtable throughout our work on fraud for your assistance. And so I'm almost a little bit overwhelmed by the task in front of us, but know that we're on the right track. Finally, before we close and bring it to a close, I wanted to thank all the people who participated or joined us by YouTube, which I think will be posted, but we had over 100 people at some point participate on YouTube. And that, for anyone who follows us regularly, we do stream all of our events on YouTube to provide transparency on our work, but also to permit greater engagement with the IAASB. So we welcome input from those who've been observing our activities. So with that, I think it's time to bring it to a close. I'm excited for what comes next in terms of the next 2 roundtables, but I think this is the way we're going to figure out how to get this standard right going forward, and right in a rapid fashion, because we're able to gain knowledge and insights in a much more rapid fashion through this type of activity. So thank you for those who are off to bed, sleep well. For those who are just beginning their day, have a great day. We'll speak to you shortly.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good night.